Welcome to the At the Coalface podcast with your host, Jason Greenwood. This podcast is all about what it's really like in the trenches of digital and e-commerce. Hello, everybody. We've got a super exciting show for you today. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Rathna Sharad from FlavorCloud to the podcast. Welcome, Rathna.
Thank you, Jason. Great to be here. I'm excited to chat.
You have got a super exciting company on your hands. You are the founder and CEO of FlavorCloud. You guys have been up and running for over 4 years now, just about 4.5 years. But this is certainly not your first rodeo in leadership. You were CEO of Runway to Street for nearly 5 years, based out of Seattle. You were also very senior at Microsoft for over 6 years, also in Seattle. Worked your way up through program management, product management, etc. So this is certainly not your first rodeo as an entrepreneur, as a leader, and it's super exciting to be talking to you today about your platform.
Thank you. I've certainly had a very interesting journey and across many different diverse areas. But I think the common thread there is cross-border logistics, which I've been doing for about 20 plus years now, and also e-commerce enablement for over 10 years.
It's an awesome background. It's actually probably the perfect background to have, considering that FlavorCloud is a cross-border logistics platform specifically targeted at e-commerce. And if for those that haven't heard of FlavorCloud, I guess they probably would have heard of other, similar platforms like Pitney Bowes, and if we look at Global E and some of the other quote unquote cross-border platform vendors, that they may have heard of those platforms, may not have heard of FlavorCloud, but FlavorCloud really enables brands to go global with a door-to-door logistics platform from almost any country to almost any country, if I understand the platform correctly. Is that
Absolutely. That's exactly what we do. So making international shipping easy, affordable, and friction-free anywhere to anywhere. So we're a headless global logistics service, and think of us as the modern e-commerce, global e-commerce enablement service. Unlike some of the legacy players like Pitney Bowes and Global E, we focus on core cross-border logistics and the pain points around it: customs, shipping, compliance, and reverse logistics. All of the different aspects of enabling cross-border. And we don't focus on the things they do like payment, currency, localization, and fraud, because we believe that baseline e-commerce platforms today support all of those functions. We really focus on how do we make supply chain optimization.
And if we look at some of those other competing platforms, oftentimes they want to become the merchant of record for international transactions, right? They want they take over the kind of the ownership and the responsibility for the cross-border transaction from a payment perspective, from a currency settlement perspective, from a tax obligation perspective, from a shipping perspective, from a liability perspective, pretty much across the board. That they become almost like the merchant that sold the good, as opposed to just the transporter of those goods, where you guys feel like you're very staying in one very niche lane, which is we're going to enable international logistics as if it was local logistics. In other words, most local e-commerce players, they will be plugged into a local courier or local couriers using maybe a local courier aggregator platform. In ANZ, very popular platforms are Starship and Shipit and a couple of other courier aggregators in there. There are other courier aggregators that are popular around the world, ShipBob, etc. And for you guys, it feels very much like you're sticking to your knitting. You're sticking to that specialization of, hey, we want it to be as easy for you to plug into international logistics as it is to plug into local courier providers.
That's exactly it. So the way to think about it is that we're this horizontal cross-border logistics platform, and we plug into shopping carts and we plug into warehouses in the back end. In the shopping cart, we're essentially in the native checkout experience. So we are not merchant of record, but we are enabling all of the cross-border capabilities like going against our carrier network, which is the largest cross-border network in the world, 300 plus carriers across first mile, global mile, and last mile optimization. So multiple service levels, and think of it as volume discounted rates. So heavily discounted, incredible rates that customers can leverage, which in turn translates to great conversion rates. So we focus on international conversion from a shipping aspect. The second thing we focus on is automation of product classification and providing a fully guaranteed, accurate landed cost that's inclusive of duties, taxes, and fees, and helping the merchant collect that upfront from their end consumer. So really focused on how do we make a market-specific optimization in line in their existing checkout experience without taking you off into a completely different checkout portal. That is the typical experience with these legacy platforms. And then once the order is placed in the back end, we are just a simple API call, if you will, to get a label. So very much like a DHL or a FedEx, except you have access to the entire network. And then we become the importer of record and actually take on all of the aspects of automation across import, export, global mile, and really ensuring that the door-to-door delivery is seamless. And we are taking on liabilities there.
And one of the big challenges that merchants always have, and for that matter, agencies and technical partners, et cetera, is that oftentimes integrating global cross-border capabilities into even mainstream platforms like Shopify, BigCommerce, Magento, et cetera, is very complex, because usually there's just a suite of APIs provided, and then the middleware has to do the heavy lifting. You have to connect via the checkout and some sort of customized checkout element to that third party. You have to send them effectively the cart contents, weight, volumetric weight, origination, destination, and then you effectively get a quote back to present to the customer with more than one option, if there's more than one option provided by the effectively the carrier aggregator, which is, we can think of you guys as almost like an international carrier aggregator as opposed to a domestic carrier aggregator. And so you're really plugging that gap. And through those native integrations with Shopify and BigCommerce, as far as I know, those are your two primary out of the box native integrations, plug and play, let's go. And that makes it much faster and much easier for merchants to onboard your technology into their checkout.
Absolutely. If you have that, so that checkout experience automation for Shopify or BigCommerce with our app is a 30-minute installation. You're up and running because it's plug and play, and we're fully integrated in the store experience and are able to do all of everything from classification to landed cost to providing the rates. So rather than an aggregator that's showing rates, we're also different in that we pick the winning options. So it's an AI-driven routing engine that's able to, based on commodities, routes, merchant-specific data, product-specific data, able to provide the best winning option for, let's say, standard service, express service, and possibly an economy service. That is the best choice. And then the consumer can make a choice. It is also an optimization engine that learns based on the brand and their consumers' preferences. So there's a lot of AI built into it to make that happen.
And one of the things that major merchants have to deal with is a debate between, do we present matrix rates? Do we present real-time rates with a margin for ourselves or a service fee or some sort of additional tariff added on top for ourselves? Or do we always deal in real-time rates? And so in order to have predictability, oftentimes what most merchants will do, at least for domestic shipments, if let's say they operate in New Zealand or they operate in Australia, they'll have what's known as matrix rates, which for the audience's benefit is effectively a rates table that basically says for an order that is either over a certain weight or is over a certain dollar value, maybe we'll either give free shipping or there's a flat shipping fee, or there's various different rules that define a matrix of rates depending on where the item is going and what the items are composed of. Now, obviously, when we start going international, it starts getting much more tricky, much more complex. So I'm guessing that in the majority of instances, your merchants that are doing cross-border shipping internationally, they're getting real-time rates based on
Yep.
the current cart composition. And then at
Yep.
that point, I'm guessing it's a configurable element of the app that they can either add a surcharge on top of that or no surcharge. They can have fixed rates to certain countries and where they can agree to share some of the costs of that shipping. I'm guessing that there are configurable rules within your app depending on the availability of services that's returned via the API.
Absolutely. So really a market specific way to customize your checkout, add markups, and essentially optimize how you show the rates, including discounts and flat shipping and any other optimizations that you'd like to do is available through the app. And to your question on the dynamic versus what we call static, which is the matrix rate card, international really is so different than domestic because of the fluidity of everything from trade rules to compliance to the rates themselves. And as a result, our platform is about dynamic rates, real-time rates, and being as accurate as possible. And also learning from what's working, not just based on the carriers themselves, but also the customs clearance aspect. And that informs the choice that we present to consumers at checkout.
And I guess that's down to time, right? So obviously, if one carrier or one service is known to clear customs much faster than another because it's a premium service, and of course, the customer would typically pay more for that service. But if speed is of the utmost priority to them, then oftentimes customers are willing to pay that premium. And so presenting those options to them, there's the dichotomy of choice sometimes though, too. And so I guess that's what you're saying. You're saying that, hey, sure, we might be able to technically present 100 different options, but we need to have a rule set in place that doesn't overwhelm the customer so that we pick, say, the top 2, top 3, top 4 options based on best price, best service, best speed, various different factors that go into deciding which options we will actually present at any given point in time to the customer in real.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the other aspect to it is the supply chain issues that came to the forefront with the pandemic. It's a lot about what if a carrier were to shut down, the USPS issues that you've heard of, or pandemic related delays. Any number of these issues is why we think about redundancy and resilience in the network and building that in real time.
And I'm guessing that the two major benefits, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I imagine the two major benefits that you bring to the table over, say, local merchant in ANZ, they will typically connect with, so in New Zealand, they'll have a contract with New Zealand Post / Courier Post. In Australia, they'll have a contract with AusPost. And so therefore, all of their international shipping will go through that local flag carrier and their international partners once it leaves the country. And I'm guessing that from your perspective, the two massive value props that you would present to the customer are, that you are not overly dependent on one carrier, one international carrier that may have those challenges, as you said, with congestion in the network, etc. We've heard about Australia Post shutting down for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks at a time, where it's not collecting parcels from e-commerce merchants because the network is too congested. We've heard the same in New Zealand, not quite to the same degree, but certainly getting parcels out of country has proven challenging, especially during the peak of the pandemic. So I guess it's access to carriers to even be able to get parcels moving quickly, but 2, having options in terms of comparisons of price, because as we know, New Zealand Post and Australia Post, sometimes they're competitive and other times they're not, depending on the mix of the parcel, the size of the parcel, the weight of the parcel, the destination, and what the items actually are from a customs clearance perspective and the category perspective. So I'm guessing that you guys really present yourselves as that holistic global alternative that gives merchants options in real time, depending on what that network is doing globally.
Absolutely. Those are 2 key components. I would add a third benefit, and that is we have network-wide rates. So think of it as Amazon-like discounts without you being one in terms of volume, right? So you can plug into the network and get access to the best partner rates that we have.
And I guess the final thing is you don't actually have to have an account with these hundreds of carriers that you connect to. Whereas obviously with New Zealand Post, Australia Post, you actually have to have an account with them, a credit account with them, and you got to go through the process of applying and be approved. And there's a fair bit of effort required there. You've got to you're establishing a credit account with them. And if a merchant wanted to establish credit accounts with all of the 200, 300 carriers that you work with, that would be virtually impossible, right? So it's effectively one account established through you guys. You have the accounts with the 300 carriers plus that they bill you, and then you on-bill the merchant for their percentage of the fee.
Exactly. And because this is international, it's never just about the carriers. It's also about the efficiency of what happens in the import country. And merchants don't have to worry about what is the tracking like across these carriers. Are you able to see door to door just like you would for a domestic parcel? And are you able to get through customs clearance without you calling that destination country, China, UK, wherever, and figuring out what's happening to the clearance of that parcel.
And one of the major challenges that merchants have started having since countries like New Zealand and Australia have modified their tax law to where imported items have to have their tax prepaid in the country of origin by the customer before they arrive in country. Whereas before, you would often see messages at checkout, merchant is not responsible for any taxes or duty required at point of entry into the recipient's country. And so it was kind of a catch-all, a blanket catch-all. And some platforms like Avalara and other cross-country tax platforms would have an element of understanding cross-border taxation and tariffs and duties, but not all were implementing those technologies. And as a result of that, most merchants really struggle to know which countries were required those taxes and levies imposed at the country of origin and then repatriated back to the destination country via cross-border taxation policy, etc. So there is an absolute minefield of legislation globally because every country seems to approach this slightly differently. And it also depends on the total value of the shipment as well, which seems to change every year. And so how do you start to ease some of the concerns or problems or challenges around, instead of just warning your customers, you might have to pay this massive duty when it arrives, you give peace of mind to the merchant and peace of mind to the customer. That's been all dealt with up.
Yeah. So the way we actually deal with that is through FlavorCloud Global Network. It also represents a customs clearance network in addition to the carrier network, where we're automating everything from pickup from the warehouse all the way through to export clearance in the origin country and import into the destination country. Upfront in the shopping cart, we've provided a fully guaranteed landed cost that is inclusive of duties, taxes, and fees that the consumer has paid, what we call delivery duties paid, a DDP solution. And that means then FlavorCloud is going to do all of the heavy lifting, everything from checking for the de minimis, which is the value of the order, to identifying it's actually not just country, but commodity specific aspects of what do you do in terms of taxes, duties, and how do you remit it. And just Australia and New Zealand, you also have EU and UK that have done VAT changes. Now, is going to move to a DDP model pretty quickly. Over the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to see some massive transformation because every government wants a piece of the tax revenue.
And yeah, they were missing out. And of course, the local merchants were crying foul, saying, hey, we have to pay our tax on everything that we sell. The local, in New Zealand, it's GST. Obviously, in the UK, it's VAT. In Australia, it's GST. But all of those local providers, those local merchants are subject to both collection and payment of GST. And so they're going, well, look, we're hamstrung by these import products. Not only are those international volumes higher, and so therefore they tend to have economies of scale, so they can sell product cheaper already. But then when people are importing them, if they're not having to pay any kind of duty or any kind of local GST on those import goods, then we're doubly hamstrung. And we're effectively, how can we compete with these international vendors, particularly when they used to go through, for example, marketplaces like Amazon and eBay, and those were the first international marketplaces that started to be subject to the tax because they were easy targets for local governments to tax because it was all centralized. But then we have these literally millions of rats and mice merchants where it was initially costing the destination country more to collect the tax on those items if they were under a certain value than it was in the tax that they collect. And so therefore that's why they just didn't bother. And that's why in New Zealand for a long time the threshold was $1,000. In Australia it was always around that $400 mark. Actually, sorry, it was the other way around. New Zealand was
$400. And
whereas now the governments are saying, no, we're going to offload that responsibility to the merchant and the originating country instead, so that it doesn't actually cost us anything. And it actually has to be prepaid before it even arrives and is released from customs. And so I think that's what it sounds like, is that's leading the charge for this international harmonization of the way those taxes are levied and collected and remitted.
Yes, so it's putting the onus on the merchants, right? So you still have to do all of that. And it's a lot of heavy lifting for the merchants, which is where we come in and are able to make it very simple for them to have the collection up front, and then we remit on their behalf to these governments. And we're doing it at the transaction level. We have a full understanding of what needs to be remitted based on the order and the contents of. And in addition to that, the additional impact, if you didn't address that, is that parcels are held and go through formal clearance, and that causes expediting through customs and automating customs processes so that the end consumer has a great experience and they're not waiting weeks and receiving surprise bills is what we do for them.
And I guess one of the most complex services that you offer is the duty calculation. Tax is one thing because that's a fixed amount and it's consistent all the time. But what's not consistent and changes seemingly every single year and across categories and specific products even is the duty levy. And so if somebody's got a mixed cart and they're buying one piece of home electronics and they're buying something else, they're buying a small piece of whiteware, or they're buying clothes, and then they may be buying some bedding, the levies that would get applied to those in each destination country can be radically different depending on what local industries they're trying to protect. And so for you guys, obviously that is a massive effort to keep up with what's happening globally from a duty and levy perspective on those specific categories of goods, particularly on mixed carts, because on one item there might be no duty and on another item there might be 30%. And so you guys dealing with that helps to prevent merchants running afoul of local regulations and law.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Really understanding for every single country around the world what the specifics are in terms of compliance at the commodity level, and being accurate about commodity classification are two key components there, and automating all of this so that we really stay compliant and it is accurate and it's real time. So that's a big piece of it. One that you didn't touch upon is a third component, which is the fees bucket. It's actually pretty nebulous, and it can be any number of fees, from brokerage to surcharges that are specific to commodities. And it could be something like a customs storage fees. It can be any number of these things depending on that specific shipment. And so the fees component is also one that FlavorCloud includes in that landed cost calculation, which is why we're able to be highly accurate. So our accuracy is 99%. And we're not going to charge the merchant or the end consumer additional bills.
And I guess that would cover things like fumigation fees if you're importing wood products, and any kind of other fees that are charged by customs in the destination country. And
like 200 different codes, and Brazil has 50 of them. So it's anything from shipment preparation to bonded storage to formal clearance to DG, or any number of things.
It's pretty overwhelming, isn't it? So how did you decide that this was a game you wanted to get into, given, I guess, its complexity, given the challenges of the space? Was this an itch you wanted to scratch, or did you have friends that had challenges with this, or what? I mean, because it is a pretty complex game with some pretty large global competitors. So in terms of picking a space to go into, it feels like this would have been one of the most challenging.
Yes, actually, the reason I'm here is very much my story. So I'll give you the how it all began. So I have been leading product organizations for the last 25 years. I'm an engineer turned product leader. And the first decade was I just landed in the transportation space and worked forwarders, 3PLs, including stints at UPS, and also worked with DHL in Brussels and Germany. What I did was build route optimization and supply chain optimization solutions for cross-border across North America, Asia, and Europe. So think air, ocean, trucking, all modes of transportation, essentially. And those were early nascent B2C days. So primarily, I also got to work with customs organizations around the world, defining trade, tariff, regulatory contracts, and what they should look like from a technology standpoint. So that was my world for about 10 years. And then I moved to a completely different space. When I joined Microsoft, I was the founding member of the ad platform team. We were a dozen that built, that eventually became Bing Ads and 3 billion when I left, along with my co-founder, Sharad. Who's this? And in running the ad platform and working with the likes of the Amazons and eBays of the world, all the way down to SMB, I got fascinated by how we were helping make the connection between brand and consumer through it. But at the same time, what drove me to start our first company, Runway to Street, was the fact that as a consumer, I was shopping from all these international brands, and my experience was so horrendous that I wanted to bridge the gap between my prior life, enabling cross-border, and essentially the work that we were doing at Microsoft to enable B2C. I could see that was going to be the future. And so I started the marketplace, Runway to Street, and that's where we enabled small and medium brands sell internationally, thinking that's where the problem was. And we found that the larger the brand, the greater the complexity and need for a cross-border enablement service. And we also found that there were no solutions in the market that actually worked. We've literally used every solution that's been in the market, nascent duty-free that became border-free, that became Pitney Bowes solution was also something that we tried. Everybody solved a sliver of the problem. So we built the back-end technology ground up, anywhere to anywhere logistics to power our own marketplace. And we found that was the biggest value add that we provided these brands. And we started getting requests from larger brands who didn't belong in the marketplace but wanted to leverage our logistics backend. So that led to the creation of FlavorCloud. That, along with the massive change that we saw in the industry as cross-border started becoming 1 in 3 transactions. And so that's how we started the company, took the backend technology and the learnings from the marketplace and created a brand new company, FlavorCloud, and a service that any brand could leverage anywhere in the world.
That's amazing. And once you were up and running, what was you must have had, because you've got this deep tech and entrepreneurial experience and merchant facing experience. You really do have it all. And that is, you've almost got like the trifecta of experience to build a fit for purpose, fit for market platform that really genuinely meets the need, because you experienced the need yourself and you had a deep understanding of the need in the market. How did you, from day dot, were you always operating under the premise that for us to make money, we're effectively going to have to offer a better service than pretty much anyone else that does this, and we'll just add a small surcharge on top of all of the transactions that we facilitate and effectively add a margin for ourselves? Was that always the model that you wanted to run by, or is there a flat fee model, or how do you guys make your money? And was that always the way you planned on the business making money?
Yeah, we always thought, so to your point, the trifecta is really where it came from, right? We've been operators in operating the marketplace, really understand what makes sense for the brand, what the end consumer experience should look like. And that informed a lot of the decisions we made in terms of the pricing model. It needed to be super simple. You needed to understand the unit economics for every shipment, and it needs to scale with their needs. Those were the goals. And so a transactional SaaS model, pay per shipment, where we can be a net positive on every shipment. It is very aligned with the brand's goals for growth. If they grow, we grow. And that seemed like the right model. And in actually going out to market and getting feedback and really seeing that it has stood the test of time, it really makes sense because we align with the brand's goals.
And so in essence, just like your merchants can add either a percentage or a fixed surcharge to any rate that you bring into their customers, you charge a surcharge effectively for your services. So it's exactly the same model, right? So you pass on the charges that your network generates, and you add a margin for yourself as a service provider and providing all that middleware technology. And the end merchant can do the same. They can either charge at cost, they can eat some of the cost, or they can charge a surcharge. And it's their choice, and it can be based on destination, it can be based on handling fees, it can be based on a whole raft of factors of how they determine whether they want to be profitable on shipping or whether they don't want to be profitable on shipping.
Yeah, it's usually a lever between, so there's shipping costs, there's landed costs that we provide, and then our fees. And the merchant can make a choice. It's a choice between conversions that drive sales versus you're going to do markup. And that's a lever that they can choose to optimize on a market by market basis.
And I guess also a service option basis, because oftentimes the consumer that is prepared to pay a super premium for ultra fast speed, for example, they might not care about a surcharge, but the customer that chooses a super low cost option, the budget option, oftentimes they are going to be ultra sensitive, right? It has high price elasticity at the bottom end, but doesn't necessarily have high price elasticity at the top end.
Yep. And that's why it's a decision it's a brand decision. It's based on their volume, what types of optimizations they want to do, and which markets they want to focus on, and also their CAC for these different markets and conversions.
Which can be radically different by market.
Absolutely.
And for you guys, what if we were to look out 6, 12, 18 months, what does the platform not do today that you say, hey, we would love to be able to add this functionality to the platform? We love what we've done. We love what we've built. We're super proud of it. But we think we can do these 2, 3, 4 things either better, or we can enhance the service with these additional functionalities or options. And also, what types of other integrations to other platforms are you guys looking to build? Because it's all fine and good to plug into something like a Shopify or a BigCommerce, but particularly for B2B businesses, plugging into things like ERPs, WMSs, OMSs, that feels like a huge opportunity as well, because not all transactions come in via an e-commerce front.
Absolutely. So partnerships with other aspects of the e-commerce tech stack is a big focus. So for us, headless global logistics, that's the strategy, really plugging into all of these ecosystem players and having these integration. We have 3PLs, which are a big focus for us, and being in the WMS, TMS layers, being available in shipping platforms, payment platforms, integrating with them so that it's a really easy onboarding for merchants is what we focus. The APIs themselves, custom integrations, are also really simple. It's less than a week in terms of integration time, but we're always thinking about how can you make it much more easy and accessible to large brands, mid-sized brands, also marketplaces. And so that is one big area where we're going to be seeing a lot of our product as well as our partnership focus go. And then the second aspect is the thing about the space that we're in is that it is evolving so quickly. So there's a lot of change in the global trade and in the e-commerce carrier space that's happening. It's already extremely fragmented, but there's a lot of fluidity that will come with the regulatory changes that we're seeing, both for B2B and for B2C e-commerce. And so for us, it's really about network optimization, building more depth and breadth, and doing that globally in different parts of the world.
Exciting times. And where, as of today, presumably you're focusing heavily on merchants in the North American market because that's primarily where you're based and where you got your start. But where are the vast majority of your merchants located today? Is it still primarily North American merchants, or where are your top 5 markets that you guys have some really good traction building? And what are your kind of next cabs off the rank in terms of the hit list where you'd like to get some strong footholds?
Yeah, so North America, definitely, because we started there, but also China, as well as UK and EU are our biggest focus areas. In addition to that, we're looking at Australia, India, and also the Middle East.
All massive growth areas specifically for e-commerce. And it's really interesting, particularly in India. I have a lot of Indian friends and people that operate in that both domestic market and in a cross-border capacity. And one of the statistics that I think is always amazing about India is the fact that a lot of Indian customers and consumers, they went from no computer at all straight to a smartphone. They didn't even go through that ugly middle period where people had to use a desktop computer, or maybe they had to move to a huge, heavy laptop computer, to a tablet, to a phone, which is what most of the rest of the world went through that transition period over, a decade or more. Whereas a lot of Indian consumers, they went direct to mobile. And so therefore they are a mobile consumer right from day one. And so therefore they are an international consumer right from day one.
Absolutely. E-commerce has just grown in the last few years, like 3 or 4 years. It has literally gone from zero to where it's at.
Pretty explosive growth. And where we see in the West, and I'm sure you're seeing this as well, is that the UK in particular of all Western nations has the highest penetration of e-commerce as a percentage of retail of any other country in the world right now. It's pretty astonishing, isn't it? They hit in the middle of the pandemic, they hit over 40% e-commerce penetration. They're settling at about 20. I think the last month they were sitting at about 28%. It's pretty impressive, their numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think China is about 30% of cross-border e-commerce, enormous player, but Asia in general is going to overtake the Western world in terms of e-commerce. So very exciting changes ahead.
We're looking forward to it. Well, look, it has been fantastic speaking with you. Thank you for sharing your knowledge about the industry, about your platform, about the technology, about the change coming down the pipe for merchants. Now, before we finish off, and I'll talk to you about how people can get a hold of you in a moment, but we have a new segment on the podcast, which is where I turn the mic over to you. I turn the tables on myself. I let you ask any question you like of me, one question, any question, and I'll do my very best to answer it. So over to you, Rathna Sharad. What question do you have?
I am very intrigued to learn of your journey, Jason. How did you get into e-commerce?
That is a funny story, actually. It's a very funny story, but I'll give you the very short version. I tripped into this industry. It wasn't something that I went into with a ton of intention. I was in Christchurch at the time, which is the South Island of New Zealand, and I had a friend who had another friend of hers who owned an agency in Christchurch. He owned an e-commerce agency in Christchurch. This was very early days when everything to do with e-commerce was super painful, super expensive, mostly bespoke, and no one really knew what they were doing at all. And he was actually an American. He had married a Kiwi, and he was there, and I'm American originally myself. And we got introduced via this mutual friend, and he said, look, and I was between jobs at the time, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do next. I had just come out of a family business in Christchurch and was debating what were my next moves from a career perspective. And he said, why don't you? I was always a fan of technology anyway, and I was always into kind of the latest gadgets and technology. And I knew this internet thing was going to become big. I just knew it. I felt it in my bones, having seen so many technologies go through their life cycles over the years. And he just said, why don't you come work with me? We're a fast growing e-commerce agency. We're trying to figure this whole thing out. We're trying to provide amazing service to customers. Why don't you come on as a BDM? You can help us develop the sales side of the business and also deliver some of the services. We also provided hosting services at the time, and we were one of the first SaaS e-commerce platform providers at the time. It was really unheard of to have a SaaS platform at that time. And yeah, that's how I stumbled into the industry. And then I started a side hustle very shortly after starting with them. I started a side hustle with a very close friend of mine selling memory cards for cameras. And at that time, it was only cameras online. We were importing them and selling them direct to consumer in New Zealand. And we were doing that as a side hustle for about 6 months. And it grew so fast that we both needed to quit our full-time jobs to run it. And then we ran that for over 7 years, and we ended up exiting that business. And then I went back into the agency space. So that's how I got into the industry. It was a stumble.
That's a fascinating story. You have to operate to really learn.
You couldn't have said it better. It's so true. I tell you, I have such deep empathy for merchants when I'm consulting to them, because I've been there. I've been a merchant. I've worked merchant side before. I was e-commerce manager for New Zealand's largest online retailer of natural health products. And so, look, I know what it feels like to be a merchant and to have to go through all of the trials and tribulations to get to a place where you have some success in the market. And I tell you, the market will teach you lessons you can't learn any other way.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear.
Now, any people that want to get a hold of you or FlavorCloud, now you're obviously on LinkedIn. If people want to find out more, if they want to learn more about FlavorCloud and how you can help them with their cross-border logistics and all sorts of other things, with their cross-border requirements around tax liabilities and import logistics considerations and concerns, how are they best to find you? Are they best to just simply go to FlavorCloud, and just for everybody listening, it's spelled like the North American way, FLAVOR, not OUR, so FLAVORCLOUD.com. And you've got live chat available there on the website, plus a full contact us page. Is it best that people go to that website first, or would you prefer people to reach out to you on something like LinkedIn, or how should people get a hold of you?
Yeah, the website is great. LinkedIn is also
awesome. Listen, it's been such a fantastic chat with you, and I wish you guys every success. This time I'm hearing more about logistics pain right now than I think I ever have in my entire history in this industry, both from a time perspective and a cost perspective. It seems to be on every single merchant's lips. So it sounds like FlavorCloud is an awesome solution for any merchant struggling with international logistics. Thank you so much for your time, and I'd love to get you back on the podcast sometime in the next 12, 18 months and see how you guys have grown.
I would love to. Thank you for having me, Jason.
Thanks for listening to the At the Coalface podcast. If you want more At the Coalface, you can subscribe to our premium e-commerce and digital newsletter, At the Coalface Digest.